Okay, well, let's go ahead and move forward. And this chapter will not be quite as interesting as last chapter, but there is still some stuff to talk about, and we get to come back to the infamous and mysterious Melchizedek. So first, before we read chapter 7, remind yourself of what generally we talked about last week in chapter 6. Now, generally speaking, there were two categories or two main topics. The beginning of chapter 6 really brought to a close the end of chapter 5. Well, that's where we're on tonight, but we're reviewing last week to see if you remember. Yeah, so Jeanette, that was the first main point. So the end of chapter 5, he chastised them, basically saying, y'all should be more mature than you are. And he kind of equated it in kind of a roundabout way, basically saying, you guys should be adults, but you are still infants again. And you continue to be infants, not being practiced in the word of righteousness. And he didn't really expand upon what that meant until the beginning of chapter 6, and he went on to say you should move beyond elementary principles, and then he defined those, and Chuck, you started to talk about that. The elementary principles of what he thinks they should believe, that really every believer should know about, and you shouldn't have to keep being retaught about those things, or your focus should eventually move beyond those things to more deep matters of faith. And so that's the foundation of repentance from dead works. Again, dead works could be a reference to just the works that we do in the sinful flesh, but most of what the author is saying points back to the Mosaic covenant. So he's referring to the dead works in the Mosaic covenant. Not that they were bad, but they were insufficient in salvation and taking care of sin. So the foundation of dead works, and the opposite being having faith towards God. Instructions about washings, which again was very important to Jews, not nearly as important in the early Christian transition, and certainly we don't really care too much about washings most days here either. The laying on of hands, which talks about passing on or preparing somebody to receive something, and then the resurrection of the dead, most likely a double reference, but primarily focusing on the resurrection of human beings who die. So the end times when everybody is raised back to dead versus Jesus' resurrection. However, that obviously was an important first step in all of those things. And then eternal judgment, obviously a very important thing that you should probably come to know rather quickly in your faith life. So he says those are the most basic things. And if you don't go beyond those things, you're not growing. If you have to keep being reminded of those things, there's something going on in your maturity and in your ability to understand and utilize God's word, the word of righteousness, to be able to distinguish good from evil, which was the end of chapter 5. And then he moves on right after that to one of the most controversial topics in the book of Hebrews, and generally speaking in our faith, which was... So yeah, the discussion between eternal security, once saved, always saved, is the theological terminology we use, or if we can lose our salvation, and upon what grounds would it be possible to lose our salvation? What did it appear the author was saying about that subject matter? Right, so he used very descriptive and deep terminology in trying to describe somebody who has come to faith, who has been enlightened by the word of truth, who has had a legitimate experience by the power of the Holy Spirit. So all of the words and the descriptions that would be what you would apply to somebody that you would say, yeah, that person has received salvation. They are a follower of Jesus. So he doesn't leave much wiggle room, like you were saying, Sue Ellen, to allow us to say, well, what if they just acted like they were Christian, but they really weren't? What if they were just at the first stages, but then they died off early, say like one of the seeds that fell on the ground and the sun baked it before it had a chance to grow deep roots, those type of scenarios. But again, he didn't, his language was very clear. He was making it very descriptive about this person. But then he goes on right after that and says, but to you guys, the ones he's writing this letter to, I don't think that's your case. So the discussion was around, well, what could he possibly mean? Was this a hypothetical situation? If it was hypothetical, then why would he say it? Now, there is exaggeration that's used in text, but to this point, why would you exaggerate about somebody's salvation? That's a pretty heavy tone, and he clearly has concern for these people, so why would he make them think they can lose their salvation? For what purpose? Another piece is maybe they were just superficial, but it doesn't sound like he's describing a superficial person. Right, imitators, and he talked about, he used the word sharing like he did earlier when somebody partakes or shares with Christ, so that actual experience of being close to Jesus, the way he described it. So it sounds like what he said, or the implication of what he's saying is you can lose your salvation. Now, that puts us in a dilemma, because what about once saved, always saved? What about the verses which seem to talk about how nothing can take us out of God's hand or separate us from his love? And those verses do say there's nothing in the human realm that can take us out of God's hand. And so how do we reconcile that? But if we're looking at the context of just Hebrews, because the rest of the Bible didn't exist, some of the writings would have existed and some of the teachings would have existed, but the entirety of the Bible didn't. So the only context that's most important is what he's been saying. And so what I tried to allude to last week is there's two things always going on when a writer writes a letter. One, he's writing a letter to communicate a point, or he's trying to accomplish a purpose, and we actually have not yet come to his purpose statement. His purpose statement is actually almost towards the end of the letter. So we just take inferences based upon what he's saying, and almost all of the verbiage that he uses, he uses terminology of until the end, terminology of a process that lasts for the duration of your lifetime. So he equates that also with our walk of faith. Your walk of faith should be proven by a lifelong adherence. Now, there will be ups and downs. We know that. He knew that. There has to be a distinction to what he's saying. But he is going to say something else later, so we're not going to dive too much back into that. So we're kind of left with the dilemma of, does he wrap this up with a nice, pretty bow, and will he tell us that, yes, you can be secure in your salvation or your belief about your salvation, and how? So we're going to go ahead and move on to Hebrews chapter 7. I will read this for us, so if you want to follow along, you can do that. Verse 1, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness. And then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior was blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, If perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it was witnessed of him, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." For on the one hand, the former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." This makes Jesus a guarantor of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, and separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So, obviously, there's a lot there. If you were following it closely, there's a lot of point A, point B leading to point C, just following something through logically, and he kind of loops back around. So we're going to kind of unweave that a little bit and figure out what exactly he's saying. But first, and if you were paying close attention, you'll have seen it in this passage. But first, let's remind ourselves of what we know about the priesthood. When was the priesthood established? Right. Right. So they came out in Exodus. They were given it at the end of Exodus throughout the book of Leviticus. And then Deuteronomy, if you've never heard about it, Deuteronomy is just a repeat of Leviticus. Why? Well, it's the second, or the deutero, giving of the law. So when you read those two together, you're like, why am I getting the law twice? Well, it's because Leviticus was the first giving of the law. Deuteronomy was them being reminded of the law at the end of their wilderness travels, essentially. So yeah, it was in both, but it was when was the law given? Mm-hmm. Right. So all of that was established at one point in time, and what one point was that? Yes. Yeah. So Mount Sinai, they came out of Egypt. They were led up to Mount Sinai. Moses went up there. It's one of those questions, Chuck, like, duh. So it all happened at the giving of the law. You know, we normally think of the 10 Commandments, but Moses was up there for a long time and got all 400 and something commandments plus everything else, including the establishment of the priests and the Levites when they got into the Promised Land, and then the establishment of the tabernacle, which was the traveling temple in that regard. So it was set up then. So it did not exist as the formality before that. That's when it was established as part of the law and part of the practice of the people. Yeah. Yeah. The the short answer to that is yes and no. You can, so as I said pretty early on, Moses wrote this, and he wrote it when he wrote it. He didn't write it in the beginning when it happened, right? So the only thing he could write with firsthand knowledge is everything that he experienced. Everything else was what was passed on through history, or everything else is what God revealed to him to write down. So we see when he wrote, he would reference his own time periods things, whether it's people, events, the way you talked about things, the way you did things, sometimes in reference backwards, which meant that he wasn't imposing upon what happened, but he was just using his terminology and his understanding to speak about before then. Now, yes, we know that there was worshiping of God before Moses because, well, it happened all the way up to Noah, after Noah to Abraham, all of those. Like, we know there was worshipers of God. We don't know exactly how it worked, but we know a lot of cultures and a lot of religions had temples. They had priests of some sort. So it is not out of sync with what could have happened. But as far as the established order of things and when God said this should happen and this is how it should happen, that was established at Mount Sinai. Before that, it was probably a part of their quote-unquote normal practices, but it was just as normal as it would have been for any other religion. They just happened to be worshiping the one true God. So there is evidence to say that there was that, but it was not commanded or it was not structured. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. But going back to the establishment of the priesthood, that happened at Mount Sinai. Who was the first priest? Aaron, and he was also the first what kind of priest? So you have the priests and there's another kind of priest. Technically, but that's not what I'm referring to. High priest. So there's Aaron, who was the first high priest, the one that would go into the Holy of Holies, offer the one big sacrifice for all of the sins of Israel. And then there were the other priests who worked in the temple or doing the temple things. And Jeanette, those were what the Levites were. So the priestly order was from the Levites, and then the high priests would come from one specific line of Levites, and that was the bloodline of Aaron. You could only be a high priest from the bloodline of Aaron, which obviously meant you were also a Levite, but not all Levites could be the high priest. I don't know specifically his history, but by the time of Caiaphas, and we know that Caiaphas had a very strong connection to Rome, we know that Rome liked to meddle with things, and so they kind of imposed their will, whether they got in the pocketbook of a true high priest or they exercise their political power to say this will be your high priest. So we're not completely sure. Yeah. So I doubt he was, but even if he was, his alliances were more towards Rome than they were anything else. John. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So they're comparing, where this whole argument comes from is the author of Hebrews is comparing Jesus to the high priest and saying that the high priest who Jesus is greater. What he's doing is he's again showing how Jesus fulfills all of the things in the Old Testament. Thus, he has to fulfill the role of the high priest. Or maybe looking backwards, the high priest was the foreshadowing of Jesus. And so he is the greater high priest because he's the only one that can go to heaven, which makes him better than any other high priest. And there's also something else that makes him better, which was stated here. But moving on into Hebrews chapter 7, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, now Salem we understand to be generally referencing Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem. Now, we actually have another scripture which helps allude to that. Psalm chapter 76 says, in Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion. There he broke the flashing arrows, the shield, the sword, and the weapons of war. So the writer of that particular psalm uses the same reference, Salem to Jerusalem. So there's a precedent in Scripture kind of focusing on that Salem was probably Jerusalem. But before it was Jerusalem, it was in the hands of what group of people? Do you know? Who owned the promised land before the Israelites? Yeah, they are always fighting them. Nope, not Samaritans. They didn't exist yet. It's the Canaanites. So the Canaanites were generally a large group of people, of which they included subgroups, and there were some other groups like the Hittites. So of this, it was actually a Jebusite city. It was in the area where the Jebusites would have dwelt. Now the Jebusites were a descendant of Canaan, who was a descendant of Ham, who was whose son? Right, one of Noah's sons. Yeah, I believe so, yeah. So the Jebusites were, that kind of traces it back to Noah, giving us at least that point of a historical reference. But they're essentially, the Canaanites, or maybe kind of pre-Canaanites, in the time when Abraham would have encountered Melchizedek. So that kind of gives us a geographical reference as well. So it goes on, priest of the Most High God. So it's referring to Melchizedek as the priest of the Most High God. What does that sound like? Okay, it sounds like he serves Yahweh, and that he's also he's a priest. So he serves that religious function. In the previous half of that verse, they called him a king. So he's both a king and a priest. Again, when was the established order of the priesthood? At Mount Sinai, which was much later than this. So again, that's kind of that answer to your question, Sue Ellen, that there were, priests. And so what does it mean that he was a priest? What does it mean that he was a priest and a king? And what did it mean that there was a priesthood that was a legitimate, seemingly legitimate priesthood prior to the establishment of the priesthood? Now, what is interesting about this, and I didn't realize this until studying this, and there was no other implications. It's just interesting to know this. So it sounds as if it's referring to, and I think it is referring to, the God of Israel, Yahweh, but there was also a Canaanite god called El, E-L. And that god would have also been, if you translate it into the terminology of today, that god would have also been known as the Most High God. Now, that could still refer to Yahweh, because the Jebusites were a descendant of the Canaanites, the descendant of Ham, the descendant of Noah, who was a follower of God. It could just have been a distorted image of God. So it could still have been referenced back to Yahweh, but what I find interesting is it might have a double reference. It might have a reference to Yahweh. It might have a reference to some false Canaanite god. We don't know, though. It doesn't say. But that's an interesting piece of what it does say there. But regardless, what it means is that there is a non-Israelite religion in the area of Jerusalem prior to the establishment of everything that is Israel, right? And it seems as if these are people who worship Yahweh from what it appears to sound like. Interesting to note. He met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. Do you remember where Abraham was coming from at this point? Or what it's referencing when it says the slaughter of the kings? Well, Abraham had a nephew whose name was Lot, and Lot found himself in what area? He found himself in Sodom and Gomorrah, and actually found himself more than maybe what we attribute, because he was in Sodom and Gomorrah, and there were 4 kings in that region who came in and took over the area, and in taking over the area, they took people captive. One of the captives was Lot, Abraham's nephew. So Abraham goes in to fight these 4 kings to rescue Lot, and so that's what happened. He was rescuing his nephew, so he went in and slaughtered these kings, and he's coming back from that battle with his nephew when he is encountered by this mysterious figure that pops up out of nowhere. So, let me ask this question. Based upon what we know about ancient history and how things worked, Abraham just slaughtered these 4 kings, a seemingly impossible task, and now you have another king coming up to him and blessing him. Why do you think that king has blessed Abraham? Or why might he have blessed him? Okay, that could be. So maybe he recognized, and it might be true, maybe he recognized God's hand in it. But let's take God out of the picture. If an army goes off and fights another army and comes back victorious, what are the other kings and kingdoms going to do around you? They bow down. They pay honor and homage to him, right? So what it could have been, in part, it could have been, or at least it might have sounded like, that the king of Salem, Melchizedek, it makes sense that he would bless Abraham, because why would you curse somebody who clearly had a superior army, right? No, not yet. This was before. No pun intended. Lot did find himself in a lot of trouble. Or at least he didn't choose the right place to call home. Yeah, yeah, right, right. Right, and I think that's probably what was happening. I just wanted to also point out, we think about that in the theological sense because that's kind of where our mind goes. But we also have to think that these are real life events happening to real life people, and sometimes what we see as unique might actually be just what they would have normally done in that day and age, but maybe it's a little bit more superior or better than that. Right. I mean, clearly, if he's the God of the Most High, and if that references Yahweh, clearly, if he's a priest of the God Most High, he should have an idea of what's going on. So he goes on, verse 2. And to Abraham, he apportioned a tenth part, and to him, Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. So Abraham goes off and has this battle. And after the battle, you get the spoils of the war. You walk away with goods. You walk away with gold. You walk away with slaves. You walk away with all these other things. And so he encounters Melchizedek. Melchizedek, a king and a priest, blesses Abraham. And so Abraham then in return gives him a tenth of what he got from battle. What does that sound like? There's a couple of references that can sound like. A tenth. So we normally think of a tithe, something that's attributed over to God, dedicated to God. So it does sound like that. However, it is not that because it is something else that we'll read later in the text. But that gets you in the right frame of mind. A tenth normally has the connotation of something that is given over to God for God's purposes. And we're going to see exactly what that is in a second. So that was mostly in Joshua when that happens, but there are times also in Abraham before we get to Joshua and all of that where God says, do not. This was not one of those occasions. It doesn't even seem to appear that God told him to go to war. He just went to get Lot. And so it was almost just like he was out to save his nephew, and thankfully he had God on his side in all of this. And then clearly, obviously, those other kings were not the greatest people in the world, needing a little bit of correction. So Abraham gives Melchizedek, this random dude out of nowhere, who is a king and a priest, a tenth of everything that he just won. And then it goes on to say something weird. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. Then he is also King of Salem, that is King of Peace. So what the author has done here is he's adding an editorial note. For what benefit, we're not completely sure, but when it says he is first, he's talking about Melchizedek, saying primarily Melchizedek's name, if you follow the translation of it, means king of righteousness. And remember, names meant a lot back then. And then, after that, he is also king of Salem. Well, Salem, if you translate that, is king of peace. So it almost looks like the author is looking into it and seeing how names are important, and it's talking about he's a king of righteousness and a king of peace. And that's the translation of his name. So it doesn't appear necessarily that he's looking at Melchizedek saying, based upon Melchizedek's actions, he's calling him righteousness and a king of peace. He's just looking at the terminology of his name. And so that begins the next somewhat confusing section of what he gets ready to say. He's taking a shift in his translation or interpretation methodology. Verse 3. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So who is the author talking about in verse 3? Nope. Well, yeah, so he's making the connection to Jesus, and he makes it right there, but who specifically is he talking about when he says he's without father or mother or genealogy, beginning or end? Yeah, he's talking about Melchizedek. And so that's something we have to understand. Like, we read that, and we instantly read that to be Jesus. And what the author is doing is he's comparing Jesus and Melchizedek, but this is first and foremost talking about Melchizedek. So he is saying that Melchizedek had no father or mother or genealogy. Do you think Melchizedek had no father or mother or genealogy? Okay, so maybe there was no understanding of his ancestry. That could be one potential answer. But then let me add this on. So this might turn that one down. The next phrase, he had no beginning of days, nor end of life. Now that part's not, you can't lose that. So is it saying that Melchizedek is eternal? Well, that's what it sounds like it's saying, but is he saying that the person Melchizedek was literally eternal? It's a question we have to ask, because that's essentially what he says, right? So we have to ask the question, why is he saying these things? Is he saying them because that was true of Melchizedek, or is he saying them for another reason? Okay, so we could make that jump. You know, maybe it was a theophany, or maybe it was an angel of God, but most of the time it directly says those things, right? That's the only time we assume those things, is when it says those things. And it could be, and I'm not saying that's a bad inference, but that is one way to potentially solve the problem. John, did you have your hand up? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop you right there, because we're not quite to that point yet. So looking at verse 3 there. That he's still alive? Right. And so that's what, to me, raises the question we have to ask, is that what the author means? Yes. So here is what's happening. This is where you have to be very close to what he's saying. So what the author is doing, because there is almost next to nothing said in the Old Testament scriptures about Melchizedek, right? There's only that one story with nothing else. There could be some Jewish tradition that was passed on over thousands of years. We don't know that. But what the author is doing is he's actually going back and referencing the text. So he's not making an interpretation of what actually happened. He's making an interpretation of the text. And so what he's doing is he's going back and saying, Melchizedek appeared out of nowhere. right? He had no beginning of days. He disappears at the end of the account. We know nothing about the end of his life. He had no end of life. We know nothing about his genealogy. We know nothing about his mother or father. Why? Because the text doesn't say anything about it. So this is what I say. He uses a very interesting, and I wouldn't say suggested form of interpretation, but he's using this form of interpretation to make his argument not about Melchizedek. He's using the story of Melchizedek to then point to Jesus, because what he's doing is he's building a bigger argument about Jesus. So what he's doing is he's looking at the literary person of Melchizedek versus the literal person of Melchizedek. Does that make sense, Chuck? So there was the possibility of that, but the problem of that is referencing him as an actual person, referencing him as an actual king of an actual location. It doesn't seem to allude to that. That's more just us trying to find a solution when it appears more likely that what he's doing is he's looking at the text and saying, what is the text able to tell us and not able to tell us? And then he's drawing these conclusions that we probably would not try to draw ourselves today, but he's doing it to make a greater point. So he's taking it outside of that. Right. And that's really part of what's going on, is we have to say, well, what is he really saying? Because sometimes the writers, especially of the New Testament, Paul does this too. He quotes a text, and then how he uses the quotation of that text would not be how you and I would normally call good interpretation. But not because he's trying to interpret the text, but because he's trying to use the text to make a larger point. Mm-hmm. Now, the word forever just sums up everything he just said, though. So it's the entirety of verse 3 that's really the problem. And that's where that's why I say we have to stop and ask or look at, what is he doing? And he's looking at the text of Melchizedek and not the person of Melchizedek to make his points. That's what it appears to be. But basically what he's doing is he's trying to draw two parallels together. Between Jesus, as we'll continue to see, Jesus was not a Levite, nor was he of the line of Aaron. And he's drawing the connection with another priest of the Most High God who was also not a Levite and who was also not a son of Aaron. So what he's doing is he's trying to make this connection, because we're going to find out that Jesus is not those things. So if Jesus is not those things, how can the author claim that Jesus is a high priest? Does that make sense? He has to prove why Jesus is a high priest and why his high priesthood is legitimate, because it's different than the normal. Does that make sense? He's going back, he's trying to find precedent, basically. Exactly. So that's the point the author is making. Melchizedek was called a priest of God before there were priests, before there was Aaron. And so it's clear that the priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. The priesthood is bigger than the sons of Aaron and the law. Yes. It could have. However, this argument only relates to his priestliness. So, yeah, they might have an arguable point if they were arguing against Jesus' ability to be a priest, but that's not mostly what Jesus was focused on. Jesus was focused on the fact that he was the promised Messiah, which we knew was supposed to come from Judah. So, yeah, if they knew he came from Judah, they should be thinking there's somebody else that comes from Judah who is the Messiah. The author of Hebrews is making the priest point, not the Messiah point. Exactly. Yeah, so he's also referencing the cultural heritage of the people he's talking to, which is their identity as Jews first. Yes, there you go, Sue Ellen. So now, what I also have to say is, because it's not how we would normally interpret the text, it is not outside of how Jews interpret text. So the way the Jews think is differently than us. They don't think in linear terms like we do, not that they don't think linearly, but we think logically in A plus B has to equal C type of things. This was actually a common interpretive principle in Jewish mindset. You could do this, and they would say there's nothing wrong for you to look at a text and see what the text doesn't say and make a point based upon what the text doesn't say. We don't try to do that very often because that's sticky ground, right? But that was common in Jewish hermeneutics or Jewish interpretation. So it's not outside of the bounds of what they considered to be true. What is also interesting, and this is just a side note, but referencing the king of Salem as the king of righteousness and the king of peace, Isaiah chapter 9 says this, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government shall be on his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his governments and of the peace there will be no end, and of the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." So it's just interesting how that lines up with the prophecy about Jesus as well. So going on to verse 4, see how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the spoils. So referencing Melchizedek, why do you think the author of Hebrews said Abraham, the patriarch? Why did he have to point out the patriarchy? Or the father of the Israelite people? Yeah. So even Father Abraham, who was greater in Jewish lineage than Father Abraham? Nobody. And even Father Abraham gave a tenth of his spoils. He gave a tenth of his spoils. He didn't give a tenth of his own stuff. He gave a tenth of something that he got from somebody else, which he won, which by rights, 100% of that should be his. So what the author is saying, pay attention. If your identity is in Father Abraham, pay attention to what Father Abraham did. Yeah, you're right. You're very right, Chuck. It's pointing to the supremacy of Abraham and then the greater supremacy of Melchizedek because of how Abraham treated him. Now I'm going to go through a long section of verses starting in verse 5, which expands upon some of this. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these are also a descendant of Abraham. So the tithe that the Levites received was how much? A tenth. And so they received it from their own people. So the author is making this connection again. Abraham recognized something about Melchizedek, and he gave him a tenth, that same tenth that would have been given to the Levites from the other Israelites. So he's drawing these connections here. What he's doing is he's trying to give a solid foundation for the priesthood of Melchizedek. Because when he builds up the priesthood of Melchizedek and he compares Jesus' priesthood to that, he doesn't have to worry about them doubting the superiority of Melchizedek. Make sense? Okay. Verse 6, "But this man who does not have his descendant from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior." So the inferior, like you said, Chuck, being Abraham, the superior being Melchizedek. So you made a very good deduction there. It is beyond, verse 8. "In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one who it is testified that he lives." So again, just showing from the textual argument that Melchizedek is somebody of greater superiority than Abraham, greater superiority than the Levites or the high priests. Verse 9, "One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him." Now, Are your great-great-great-great-grandchildren responsible for any of the good things or the bad things you do? No. Well, it depends on what ultimately gets passed down, but they're not responsible for your decisions, right? Because they were your decisions and not theirs. So, yeah. So there is no way in reality that the tribe of Levi, the people of Levi, could have actually paid tithes. Again, he's making a textual argument here, trying to say, if at any point, if it came to the argument of well, what about Levi? Well, Levi came from Abraham, and Abraham made those things. And so he's tying everything back through this one act of Abraham to this non-Israelite, non-Levite priest who was more superior than even Abraham. So he's just making this to show the reality of Melchizedek, but to also build his argument. Verse 9. Now it switches back a little bit here. Now if perfection had been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? So this is an interesting argument that you might not catch at first. The priests who came from Levi, what was their job? To give sacrifices. The priests who came from the bloodline of Aaron, what was their job? To be the high priest who offered sacrifices for the whole tribe of Israel. So if the high priest, who only comes from this one bloodline, is the only one who could offer the Israelite sacrifices, that would be a very important person, right? But the author just said those sacrifices actually did nothing to make them perfect. So if Jesus were of the tribe of Levi, and if Jesus were of the tribe of Aaron, that would not give him any rights to claim to be a great priest. Why? Because the priest of Levi and the sons of Aaron offered ineffectual sacrifices. So it's almost like what he's saying is he's going back and he's cutting down the priesthood, saying, yeah, the priesthood is fine and good and all because that's what God commanded, but even God knew and even they knew that those sacrifices were not enough to make you perfect. Why? Because you had to keep making the same sacrifice over and over and over again. So how would that make Jesus any better if he was of the tribe of Levi and the tribe of Aaron? It would make him better if he was of a different tribe or a different priestly order. Maybe a priestly order like Melchizedek. You see the argument there? So again, he's not, I can't overstress this, he's not necessarily talking about reality as it actually happened. He's using the story about what happened to build his argument to make his point. Now, I'm not saying that what he said about Melchizedek is not true, because it could be, but we can't say that it is true based upon what we know from the text. But what he's doing is he's creating an argument to make a point. And so it would have done Jesus no good to say, I'm a son of Aaron, because the son of Aaron couldn't do anything in reality, except have the ability to offer the sacrifice, which is insufficient. Verse 12. For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. What do you think he's alluding to there? Okay, so the sacrifice, well, what mandated the sacrifice? The priesthood, but what's mandated the priesthood? That's what instigated the need for a sacrifice, but where did the mandate for the priesthood and the sacrifice come from? From the law with Moses, right. They do, because the Jews kept going back to Moses and the law that was given to him as their identity. You see what he's done at every point? He keeps going back and hitting at their heritage and saying, it's all fine and good if you have that heritage, but that heritage doesn't really do a whole lot for you. Exactly. So what he's saying is the law of Moses established the priesthood. And if you change the priesthood, you have naturally changed the law, or you need to change the law because that priest would not be of the same law, correct? Yes. Yes, he's speaking of Jesus. Well, he's beginning to speak of Jesus. He's building the argument to say the law of Moses has been superseded. And we already know that because we've went through the Andy Stanley Bible study. The law of Moses was not the best law, and we're going to continue to see that. But part of that change comes with a change in how it was done. Verse 13, for the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe. Talking about Jesus, he belonged to Judah, for which no one had ever served at the altar. Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, you just said that, and the Judah tribe, just like none of the other 11, were allowed to serve sacrifices. Moses never gave them anything in the law to allow them to sacrifice. They were not Levites. Jesus was not a Levite. And so for Jesus to be a high priest, he would have to have become a high priest under a different law than the Mosaic law. Verse 14, for it is evident that our Lord Jesus descended from Judah. In connection with that, the tribe of Moses had nothing to say about the priests. Verse 15, this becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. So he spent the first part of this chapter building up the priesthood of Melchizedek. He's now spent the middle part of this chapter tearing down the idea of the Mosaic covenant, and now he's going to build Jesus up to the level of Melchizedek, at least to the level of Melchizedek, and then the new law that Jesus brings, or the new covenant. Verse 16, who became a priest, not on the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of the indestructible life. So Melchizedek was not of the tribe of Aaron. The author of Hebrews made the literary connection that he had no end of life, and he's comparing that to Jesus, who was not of the order of Levite or the sons of Aaron, who also lives forever. So he's taking this back pre-law. Why would the author of Hebrews take it back prior to the giving of the law? To establish a rationale for his argument, but there's also a bigger point. What's it saying about the law of Moses? The significance of the law of Moses. As a Jew, you based everything on it, and now the author is saying, but wait a second. Is the law of Moses everything? The answer to that question is no. Because when was the law given to Moses? When it was given to him, not before that. Not even when Father Abraham was alive. So what he's doing is he's taking it back in history and saying, whoa, okay, guys, yeah, the law of Moses is great, but it didn't exist before it existed when everything else existed. So he's taking it back. He's taking it beyond them, trying to say, okay, don't get bigger for your britches. Whatever that saying is, I just lost it. Don't get too big for your britches, because there's actually something more out there that you're completely forgetting about. Father Abraham, who you say is the father of the Israelite people, he didn't have all of that, so there had to be something more. John, you had your hand up? Okay. So that is a quotation of a psalm, and that's actually where we're getting ready to go. I'm not going to tell you what psalm. No, we're not singing your favorite song. Not tonight. But what it's doing is it's using the argument from Psalms. The book of Psalms references that there is going to be someone from the order of Melchizedek, right? And so even King David recognized that there was something important about Melchizedek. Even King David gave an allusion, he alluded to, maybe prophetically alluded to, somebody else who would come like Melchizedek. And so the author of Hebrews is saying, I'm not just making this up. There's some precedent for what I'm saying here. Verse 18, for on the one hand, the former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect, referring to the Mosaic law. So the author of Hebrews said, guys, I'm sorry, it just can't cut it. You ain't good enough to make the team. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced. So it's okay, you ain't going to make the team, but I've got something better for you, through which we draw near to God. So the previous covenant could not allow them to draw near to God. And the author of Hebrews said, well, it's because it was a car with a flat tire. It wasn't going to get you where you needed to go. You needed to change out the tire for a better tire. Now that tire has come, now we can get near to God. And so what he's doing is he's now begun to introduce, in my opinion, one of the most crucial elements of the whole argument of the book of Hebrews. But he hasn't told you yet. He's beginning to build the suspense. He's saying, okay, guys, this is what your identity is. It's not bad that your identity is in that, but you got to remember, not all of it was good. And in fact, a lot of it was bad. So if you want to claim your identity in that, you have to own up for the bad parts of your heritage. Even the fact that the law that you adhered to so closely as your identity was imperfect. But it's okay because there's something better. And he's not yet told us what that better thing is. So what he's doing is he's building it up to what all of us in here probably could guess because we sat through the Andy Stanley Bible study, but he's building it up to the new covenant. But we're not quite there yet. Verse 20, and it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. So how did you become a priest under the law? Yeah, you had, okay, could you choose where you came from? No. You were stuck there. So if you wanted to be a wealthy landowner in Israel, you prayed to not be a Levite, right? Just wasn't going to happen. Exactly. Yeah, it was kind of like a caste system. You were born into it. So it had nothing to do with a promise. It had everything to do with a heritage. Verse 21. But this one, talking about Jesus, was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. So you became a Levite, you became a priest by simply being born into it. Nothing you could do about it. Jesus became a priest not because he was born into it, but because somebody gave that to him. Who was that somebody? God. Yeah, if God gave you something, that makes you above and beyond everything else before, right? So he's setting up Jesus. This is how Jesus is better than all of that, because God gave it to him. Yes. Yeah. But we just saw last week there was a reason for hope because of two unchangeable things. What were those two unchangeable things? That has nothing to do with the author of Hebrews. Yeah, so his unchangeable character referencing the oath. What is an oath? It's a promise, right? So God made a promise, and he doesn't lie, so what does that mean about his promise? It's going to come true. God made an oath, or he made a promise that Jesus was the priest, therefore the God who cannot lie. Jesus is the great high priest. So he brings that argument back again. And then this is really leading into the meaty part of everything. Verse 22, this makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Better because it was something that could actually accomplish the salvation for sins. It was something that could actually do something effective. But, as you can probably guess, this was a big bombshell for the Jews. I think it was this Sunday or last Sunday. If somebody were to walk into church on any given Sunday and say, whoa, you guys have it all wrong. You need to go follow this guy who found these golden tablets buried in Missouri. What are we going to do, Swellen? We're going to roll our eyes and sigh, right? We're not going to believe him. Jesus appeared on the scene and said, whoa, guys, you're getting it all wrong. It was a bombshell that Jesus came. You know, we see Jesus as this great guy, which he is, but it kind of shook their worldview. And that's what the author of Hebrews is saying. Jesus came to give a better covenant. Jesus came to give a different covenant. And what was their whole identity in? The covenant. the nation of Israel, the promises that were to be given to the nation of Israel. And the author just said, I don't think it's about the nation of Israel in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, it's important for the time period that the nation of Israel existed, but I don't think the nation of Israel was the end-all, be-all. And how do we know that? Because Jesus came and gave a better covenant. So the argument up to this whole point is that Jesus is better than every single person and every single thing that the Jews identified with. Better than the priests, better than Moses, better than Aaron, better than Joshua, better than David. His sacrifice was better than the sacrifice that was given even on the Day of Atonement. All of the things about Jesus was better than everything else that their identity was in. So basically, what the author of Hebrews is saying is that Jesus did not come to save everyone by turning them into Jews. He came to save everyone by changing everything. Yes? Exactly. And that's part of the argument that he just made. If the law did everything it was supposed to do, why did Jesus even need to come? Well, let's take a step back. These guys obviously believe in Jesus because that's what the author says. Well, let's say he's talking to a group of Jews who didn't believe in Jesus. To say that Jesus came would mean nothing to them. So he could have said this argument. Was there not a Messiah promised in the prophets and in the law? So why would God have to promise a Messiah in the prophets and the law if the prophets and the law were the end-all, be-all? So the argument could still hold, even if you were to take the messianic nature of Jesus out of the equation. If you just simply went to the logic of it, God had been promising something better all along. Why would he need to promise something better if, in fact, this was not the best? Talking about the law and the nation of Israel. So yeah, good point, Chuck. Then it goes on, verse 23, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So stopping there, if we can take the opposite to be true, let's say that there was a priest that could live forever, would his continual sacrifices have been sufficient for their salvation? Not in reality, but that's kind of the argument he seems to be making. You know, the other priests, the reason there had to be so many of them, the reason they had to keep offering these sacrifices, and the reason that all these things had to continue on was they were mortal men. There was nothing special about them. But he, talking about Jesus, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. So what makes Jesus the great high priest? He lives forever. He's the only one that doesn't die. Not only that, his sacrifice is the only one that's good enough. So not only does he have the best sacrifice, he can continue to offer that sacrifice, or his sacrifice still stands as long as he lives. Well, when's he going to die? Never. So that sacrifice is done and over. Thankfully for us, because I don't think we want to be in the business of sacrificing things too awful much. Consequently, verse 25, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, the them is just referencing people in general, the people that the priests would have offered the sacrifice for. The them is just humanity. But what's also interesting about this is he's making another comparison with the previous law and the law or the covenant that Jesus established. He basically said, y'all have been digging with a shovel, but if you really want to dig a hole with a backhoe. Jesus is the backhoe. He's the one that's actually going to accomplish something, right? He can get something better done. That's kind of a what? Not quite. Well, actually, if you want to look at languages, Most languages do have a y'all in them. It just doesn't quite sound so Southern, because there is a plural they in most languages, which is all y'all, or all of you all, but then it's shortened up to y'all. So yeah, other languages do have a y'all as well. It's just not quite as Americanized. I don't know anything about Norwegians, John. Verse 26, for it is indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Yes, it's referencing Jesus. And so this is an appeal to logic. If all those other priests were mortal and insufficient and ultimately ineffective, it then seems fitting that one like this would arise. And it would be fitting that he would have all of these qualities, right? So it's basically just saying, it makes sense. If you follow it through, it makes sense that if there was going to be somebody, this would probably be what he looks like, right? Verse 27, because he has no need like the other high priest to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he has done this once and for all. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which is greater than the law, came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So what's interesting about Hebrews is that it just draws a lot of parallels between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But consequently, what that also means is, for most of us, outside of the intriguing nature of the connection, it doesn't hit us the same way that it would hit a Jew. You know, a Jew would read all of these things, and in theory, we could take Hebrews to any Jew today, and we could start talking to him about Jesus and what he's done. This would almost be a good evangelistic tool for Jews, to talk about Jesus and how he was greater than all of these things. But if we were the audience of the book of Hebrews, but we're not Jews, we would not get all of this out of it. Like, even as we study this, we don't feel the significance of it. But it's still within our scriptures, right? So what can we begin to glean from this that is actually important and relevant for our life, that is meaningful for our faith and our faith walk? Like what is it meaning to you? What are you getting out of it? What truths are actually useful? Because the fact that Jesus was greater than Abraham really means nothing to us as Gentiles in 2021. Yep. Right. Right. Now, we understand the significance of that because we understand the significance of the Old Testament. But if we were to take this to somebody in today's world, they wouldn't care whether or not Jesus was the once-for-all sacrifice versus multiple sacrifices. So what relevance can somebody today get out of this? If that question made sense. You know, if we were going to take this to any schmo on the street that doesn't believe Jesus, and you know, we tell them, you know, the Jews believed that they had to sacrifice every year, but Jesus was the once-for-all sacrifice. Now we don't have to. That's not going to mean anything to them. So what can we bring out of this that actually has meaning and usefulness? Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Yeah, there is that. I mean, so in some sense, you kind of have to take it back to the basics that he talks about there pretty early on, but also the ability to move beyond the basics, part of it being we have a God who has promised many things throughout history. And so we can take them into some of these things, and we can say, this is what our God has done. We talked about the importance of history this last Sunday. We can take people back into history. Now, not everybody will go with us, so it's not going to work for everybody. But we can go back and say, look at how this is so beautifully laid out, on how all of these things were set in place to lead to Jesus, who actually fulfilled them. And the hope that we can get out of that is, if we believe that God did all these things for the Jews, if we believe that Jesus has done all these things for all these people, we can have great hope because we know that God continues to do what he says he's going to do, right? So I just wanted to point that out because, again, like I said, I like the book of Hebrews because of the connections to the Old Testament, but at the end of the day, that's kind of all it really is that intriguing nature of how God continues to work. But it also highlights the fact that we need to be able to go deeper with our faith. We need to be able to ask these questions about some of these things that, while they're not necessarily important to our salvation, they're important to understanding God and his plan and what he's done. Because in today's world, people see a different God when they read the Old Testament and the New Testament. They say the God of the Old Testament did this, but the God of the New Testament doesn't seem like he would do that. So we have to have an answer for stuff like that, right? We have to be able to say, no, it's the same God. What makes it the same God? And why? Well, now we can go back and say, because this happened and then this happened, which led to the nation of Israel, the rest after Exodus was the nation of Israel, and it was focusing on that. And so we can say this is why God commanded and did certain things, because he was working on behalf of the nation of Israel that was working on behalf of God's greater plan to save all people through the Messiah. So we can start to make these points throughout, and understanding the history of the Old Testament helps us to understand and give answers to some of the hard questions that people might have, especially about the Old Testament. Because in the book of Joshua, for example, what does God command a lot of times? Well, yeah, he commands the sacrifice, but Joshua is about going in and conquering the land. And what is he told to do many times? Yeah, it says the men, women, and the cattle. Basically, it doesn't sound very appealing. That God does not sound like a great God, right? So how do we reconcile that? Well, number one, he's talking to the people of Israel for a specific purpose, trying to overtake the promised land. Not only that, we have to go into the history of the book of Joshua itself, which we're not going to do that tonight, but basically, we can come back and say, that was God working in a particular time period in a particular way for a particular purpose. Yeah, we might not like it, we might not agree with it, but that's not how he's working today. And our God is different than who you think he is if that's the God you see. Because actually, that's the God who's trying to make it possible for salvation to be had. That's the God who fulfills his promises. Just interesting side notes. Was that the end of that statement? Okay. You were still staying at your parents. Like, are you trying to figure out what else it was saying? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it reaffirms the Old Testament and what God was doing. It reaffirms why he was doing it. It reaffirms, we ask the question, why did God do all that with Israel in the first place? Like, couldn't he have just done the whole Jesus thing and got it out of the way? Maybe, but he was dealing with real people who messed it up a lot of the time. That kind of sounds like the book of Hebrews, where he points back and talks about how God had done these great things and they didn't believe him. And so don't be like our ancestors in the faith. Instead, do the opposite of what they did. So yeah. Next week, Hebrews chapter 8. I was going to pop in and see if there was anything interesting that caught my eye on that. Yeah, so next week we're going to begin to look at the new covenant a bit. But it's going to be pretty much a continuation of this. But the very end of chapter 8 is the most interesting part, but one of which all of us in the room have already begun the discussion on because we did that Bible study. So we get a little bit of a heads up, but now we get to take it further.